and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is the second half of our lecture regarding Mexicanos in World War I on the home front. Now, I kind of left off with a tease about the 1917 Immigration Act, and we're going to get there. But you have to understand, there's this labor shortage. And while women and African Americans are going to fill this void in the factories, there are more and more vacancies on the farms as a result. So in World War I, you have this mass exodus from the south to the north. You have women working in the factories, African Americans moving from the farms of the south to the factories of the north. You have Mexicanos moving from the farms in the south to factories in the north. But there's a problem because we have a labor shortage on the farms, which will logically be filled by Mexicanos or Mexican immigrants. But there's a problem. You see, there's a lot of fear during World War I. And we mentioned German fear a minute ago. But there's also fear not only of the international war and of Germans who are being stigmatized as potential subversives. But in addition, in 1917, Vladimir Lenin successfully overthrew the Russian government and installed communism, the very first communist nation in the world. Very quickly, a Red Scare quickly hit the United States, leading to a crackdown of dissent. This would include the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917-1918, threatening up to 20 years in prison just for speaking out against the war, speaking out against democracy, or trying to tell people to avoid the draft. So much for First Amendment rights, huh? And then you add to that the anarchist, supposed radical ideas of Ricardo Flores Magón, we talked about him before, aside the thousands of refugees that are coming across the border due to the Mexican Revolution. And you can see there was a perceived real threat or fear that immigrants may be bringing in foreign ideas that threaten the safety of the United States. The result? That fear allows nativists to gain support in passing the first major comprehensive immigration act in U.S. history, the Immigration Act of 1917. Now, I want you to please note, first of all, this bill is going to be passed over the veto of President Wilson. Wilson was against this bill. He vetoes it, but Congress will override the veto. So what does this bill actually do? It reinforced, number one, that kind of area of Asian exclusion. It creates an Asiatic barred zone that reinforces the Chinese exclusion and gentleman's agreement that excludes Japanese. So pretty much, if you're Asian, you can't get in. Again, there are exceptions to that, including for scholars and businessmen. But as an immigrant, no. But it also listed a number of groups of people who are banned from immigration, including anyone who's illiterate, prostitutes, criminals, contract laborers, unaccompanied children, idiots, epileptics, the insane, paupers, the diseased and defective, alcoholics, beggars, polygamists, anarchists, and anyone non-white or not deemed eligible for naturalization like Asians. Oh, and one more group, sociopaths, which in 1917 included homosexuals. Homosexuality was listed as, they were viewed as being a sociopath. And even if you were going to be allowed in, you would have to pass a literacy test of reading 40 words in your own language and pay an $8 head tax. Wow, that is comprehensive immigration reform right there. But this last part I talked about, that $8 head tax and the literacy test of 40 words, that was especially aimed at Mexicans, who up until this point, as we showed in our last few lectures, there was an open border. No one cared. In fact, Southern agribusiness, these large farmers, were advertising and recruiting them across the border on a daily and weekly basis. And this idea, though, of passing a literacy test and head tax was designed by the US government, in Congress in this case, and nativists. The idea was to kind of weed out the riffraff, only allow in good quality immigrants. But this stipulation of the $8 head tax and literacy test outraged Southern businesses, including agribusiness, mine owners, and railroad tycoons. For instance, as one historian noted, railroad officials claimed that Mexicans were superior to the Japanese as track workers because Mexicans, they said, were stronger and better suited to deal with the hot climate of the Southwest. Their superiority in the eyes of management, however, appears to be based more on willingness to accept a lower wage than other ethnic groups. So, to give you an example here, by 1908, the average wage, if you were a Greek railroad worker, was $1.60 a day. If you're a Japanese railroad worker, it's $1.45 a day. If you're a Mexican railroad worker, $1.25 per day. And so, yes, they are defending Mexican immigration, but not out of some noble cause or altruistic ideas. No, they're A, racially arguing that Mexicans are better suited to deal with hot weather, and B, they're cheaper. Now, to be fair here, this fear of these Southern businesses was not unfounded. The impact of the 1917 Immigration Act was swift on Mexicans. In 1918, a congressional report stated that in the first full year, more than 1,700 illiterate Mexicans withdrew their immigration applications. In other words, over 1,700 potential immigrants withdrew their applications because they realized they couldn't pass the literacy test. At the same time, 5,700 Mexicans withdrew their applications because they were either unable or unwilling to pay the $8 head tax. We're talking more than 7,000 people, immigrants, withdrew their applications. The vast majority of them will be headed to the fields, the mines, and the rail yards. And remember, this can exacerbate or could exacerbate the labor shortage of World War I. The US government was promoting that, quote, food will win the war. But tougher immigration policies, along with the Great Brown Migration, along with the Great Migration, meant that there was a labor shortage in the South. And in addition, a lot of Mexicans were fearful they were going to be forcefully drafted into the war effort. And so businesses begin to beg for help. Businesses begin to beg government for some type of relief. Following the passage of the act, agribusiness began to lobby the Secretary of Labor and the Food Secretary, Herbert Hoover, for some relief. The Food Administrator, Herbert Hoover, future president, was the foremost lobbyist to try to ease or even get rid of the restrictions of the literacy test and head tax. To ease the plight of the growers and later railroad owners and miners. As of February 23rd, 1917, Secretary of Labor Wilson, not to be confused with Woodrow Wilson, president, he would issue a departmental order that would allow the literacy test in head tax and that contract labor requirement to be waived for the temporary admission of Mexican agricultural workers. So almost immediately after it's passed, the Secretary of Labor offers a temporary waiver to the literacy test, the head tax, and that contract labor clause. Now, he would technically rescind the order after the war ends in December of 1918. But continued lobbying will see that temporary wartime measure extended until after the Treaty of Versailles is ratified in 1920. In fact, that temporary suspension of the head tax, literacy test, and contract labor clause, it will end until the end. It will last until March of 1921, the day before Woodrow Wilson leaves office. In what this temporary suspension did, and please notice that on the screen, this was not for some altruistic reason. The literal title of the hearings to debate this issue was called the Temporary Admission of Illiterate Mexican Laborers. Think how this racializes all Mexicanos as being dumb illiterate. But what this created, however, was a bracero program light. Now, please, guys, do not misquote me here. This is not the bracero program that if you look up, it will be in World War II. But this was a test run. This was not a formal agreement. This was an informal partnership that would develop in the United States during World War I, whereby U.S. employers were responsible for making arrangements with Mexico for transporting, housing, and feeding Mexican workers entering the United States to work the fields, the mines, the railroads. What is clear here is Mexican workers would be the ones who would fill the void in the fields left emptied by as white workers went to war, as African Americans and other Mexicanos moved north. They would feed American troops abroad and Americans at home. Now, theoretically, these workers were only allowed in for 6 months at a time, and that employers who were in need of labor must make a formal application to the Labor Department in which they indicated the number of workers desired, the length of time they were required, and the wages and housing conditions offered. Mexicans would then receive wages that were supposedly equivalent to the current rate of wages. In other words, you can't underpay them. In addition, employers could withhold part of those wages at the post office that would not be released until the worker returned to Mexico. Again, this was designed to be a temporary contract labor program that was a direct contract between the agribusiness or the mine owner or the railroad operator and the Mexican person from Mexico. Now, of course, this theory was, of course, that Mexicans could easily be admitted and just as easily returned, quote, thereby minimizing the permanent race problem, unquote. In addition, if you were a Mexican who was already here, maybe part of the program, Secretary of Labor Wilson would allow an illiterate worker who was already here to stay permanently and avoid the literacy test if they would pay the $8 head tax. So think about this for a minute. You're an illiterate, poor Mexican worker. You are contracted by a ranch here in Texas, say, and you can't afford the head tax. You can't pass the literacy test. So you come over here and you work for 6 months, 8 months. And when your contract's over, you want to stay, you can take your wages and pay the $8 head tax and stay. That's option A. Option B, the owner which you work for could also just as easily pay the tax for you. $8 is nothing to them. And many owners would do that if they wanted to keep the worker. So if they liked you, they think you're a good worker. I don't mean they favor you because they actually like you as a friend. They like you as a good worker. And so if you were a good worker, they'll pay the tax for you and have you stay. If they don't like you, they think you're lazy or whatever, you cause trouble, they won't do it, get rid of you. And so this became a boon to Southern businessmen. Again, mines, railroads, and agribusiness. And as a result of this, by 1921, when the program ends, it is estimated that almost 73,000 Mexican workers were admitted under this temporary admissions program. And that as of June of 1921, 3 months after the program ends, about 35,000 had returned to Mexico, which means only about half returned, while another 15,000 were seemingly permanent workers in the United States. They paid the head tax. That also means that somewhere around 20-some thousand are unaccounted for here. But again, this was all these workers are technically undocumented at this point. But yet, they were invited in to work. Many were offered to stay as employees for business owners. But they were brought here intentionally. Now, however, despite the seemingly welcoming of Mexicans as good sources of labor, if you read the congressional transcripts, not only do you see a horrible title, Temporary Admission of Illiterate Mexican Laborers, you read this congressional record regarding the decision to end and suspend the head tax and literacy test, you will see a very different story. You read just how much disdain that Anglos had for Mexicans. Listen to a few of these quotes. I have a couple on the screen. I have a couple more I'm going to read to you. The Mexicans of our day, I'm saying quoted here. So quote, the Mexicans of our day, being descendants of a race in whose veins flow a dominant measure of Indian blood, evinced the same migratory characteristics which has always been a feature of the Indian race, unquote. So again, saying that Mexicans are not really white, they're really Indian. Or the next one you see on the screen, quote, it is the character of labor that is very poor, known as the peon labor in Mexico. They come across for the purpose of picking cotton and grubbing land. Those are two occupations that they are particularly well fitted, unquote. John Garner, representative of Texas. In other words, he's arguing that they are basically racially designed by God to perform farm work. Or how about W.B. Mandeville from El Paso? And this is someone who wants laborers, like he wants Mexicans to come across the border and work for him. He says, quote, here is something that I think you folks do not grasp. And the ordinary man does not grasp at all about the Mexican laborer. The Mexican laborer is about a 13-year-old child in a growing body. So again, these are not children he's talking about. These are full-grown adults, but he's saying they are the equivalent of a 13-year-old child. Now, he says, if you treat that Mexican right, if you make his surroundings right, you cannot drive him. You can't force him. They are not people who can be driven, but they can be led almost anywhere, unquote. Or how about Roy Miller, Corpus Christi, from the Texas Cattle Raisers Association? Mr. Chairman, the Mexican is a primitive man. I have known of instances where they have torn the floor out of the house in order that they might sleep on the ground as they do at home, unquote. Or how about John Davis of Texas, who says, quote, we are wholly dependent upon the Mexican, just as we are dependent upon our wives at home, unquote. He is literally comparing Mexicans to women. Again, these are racist arguments. These are emasculating arguments. These are derogatory comments. And for the most part, these are people who want Mexican immigrants. They're in support of immigration. But they're doing so for their own greedy benefit. So this is, and of course, once you start racializing Mexican immigrants, do you really think that this is not going to, that mindset is not being spilled over to all Mexicanos? So this temporary ban, though, as you see on the screen, is going to end in March of 1921, which coincidentally coincides with an economic recession, a post-war recession. And so in 1921, during the first post-war economic downturn, compared to the 4 years they had pled with the government to allow Mexicans to enter freely, now, due to destitution and huge unemployment numbers, many now pleaded with the Department of Labor to deport those same Mexican immigrants. So they had 4 years had begged government to allow Mexican immigrants to come in. Now there's an economic downturn, and they don't want to pay Mexicans anymore. They began to beg the government to deport Mexican laborers. And of course, this fit very well with the new president, Warren G. Harding, and his America First agenda. And so it is during 1921, 1922, we will have a mini depression or a recession. And rather than provide Mexicans with relief, localities instead initiated a limited basis, a policy of transporting Mexican workers and their families back to Mexico, often under duress. This was not voluntary, this was forced. The Mexican government would actually appropriate $1 million to help repatriate 50,000 nationals. And so more than 50,000 Mexicans will be deported during 1921, 1922 under what I refer to as repatriation light, not to be confused with repatriation of the 1930s during the Depression. Again, these are all trial runs. They're going to be reused in the 30s and 40s. So we have deportation here that in 1921 that we're going to use again in 1930. We have a bracero type program, contract labor program in the 19-teens that we're going to reuse during World War II. These are all foreshadows. But by 1923, the economy rebounds. And once again, the recruitment of Mexican migrant workers resumed with vigor and continued until the late 1920s, with thousands of Mexican immigrants arriving daily at Juarez and El Paso. Now, again, most of this has been about Mexican nationals. And in theory, that's what all the animosity, all the debate is surrounding as they come across the border. But do you really think that the average Anglo-American looked at their neighbor or worker or see someone with brown skin on the streets and distinguish between who is a Mexican national and who is a citizen? The 1920s ultimately will mark a huge shift in both the United States in general and also that of Mexicanos, which of course means it's an allusion to the Roaring '20s coming. But that's a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.